I don't believe we have a lack of imagination. I think all of the individual initiatives which we see being created around the world, not just in this country, but all over the planet, I believe they show we have the imagination. I think people have got all of the creativity to be able to do things in a different way and a yearning to do some things in a different way, whether it be the transition towns, whether it be the wonderful examples that Andrew gave us from around the world, which are already being put into practice. I was going to suggest you buy my book for The Poverty of Capitalism, which have all of these things in, but now it's all been said, I suggest you spend the £8 on Bruce's book instead. But the question is, we know these are the answers. How do we not get there? What is that which is actually stopping us? And in a sense, Polly, you said this at the beginning, there are governments which have intervened to snuff out laws of ecocide. There are governments which have intervened to stop us taking back the banks into public ownership. When we paid for the banks and we left them in the shop, we decided, okay, we'll buy that, but we're actually not going to take any possession of it and control of it. There are political reasons why we've not been able to forge forward and create these new worlds which our imagination drives us to create. This is not a debating chamber. This is not some sort of vacuum in which we're trying to create a nice world. There are very strong forces of capital and of states in partnership with capital. And for War on Want and for all of the campaigns that we've run, it's always been down to that. What is the politics here? And you can keep on coming up with all sorts of lovely blueprints, write them to your heart's content, dream about them at home. But unless you've got some form of political movement which can challenge those powers, you're whistling in the wind. And again, to go back, I mean, what was lovely about all of the examples that Andrew gave us, so many of them come out of Latin America. Is that by chance? No, it's not by chance. Because those countries were crushed under the weight of neoliberal capitalism and the most extreme forms of oppression for decades. And it was in response to that that social movements across Latin America banded together and didn't just stay as social movements, but created political force. Political movements out of social movements. Think of Bolivia, all of the battles on the gas wars and the water wars, leading to the formation of a new political party, which swept to power and brought in exactly the same, corresponding to the Uruguayan president, in Evo Morales, they brought in exactly the same, the first ever indigenous president of Bolivia, overtaking 500 years of colonization to try and fight back. It didn't happen because they had imagination. It happened because they had a political movement which challenged the elite. Exactly the same as in Venezuela, and at the moment we're seeing the backlash, the reaction of forces trying to throw out that movement. In Venezuela, before Chavez, there were 1,000 cooperatives. Now there are 180,000 cooperatives in Venezuela, with a bank which is no longer owned by Santander, but it's actually owned by the people of Venezuela, with the creation of a new bank just for women, set up on International Women's Day, of all days, in 2001, to be able to lend to people so that they can use that money for social use and social production. These things do not happen by chance. They happen because of political movements. And for me, one of the important things about getting together like this is to say, we've all got these very inspiring initiatives, all of the campaigns that we're all engaged in lots of campaigns. And they're really good, and they're a sign of the richness of our movement. But the movement needs to go further. It needs to be turned into more than just the sum of its parts. It needs to be turned into some form of political challenge to the forces of capital which deny us these realities. They don't just not happen because we haven't pushed hard enough for them. They don't happen because they are prevented from taking form. And we've seen that in time and time and time again. That's surely the thing that we need to build. And War on Want's involved in some of those political initiatives in this country. For example, the People's Assembly, which we're a founder member of, which is trying to bridge all of the different political parties. So there are people in there from Labour, there are people far to the left of Labour, there are even some people who are to the right of Labour in the Liberal Democrat parties. There are people from the Green parties, all coming together because they want to have another vision of a future where we can have a political movement based on what unites us and our desire for meaningful change. But until we get to that stage and go beyond our individual campaigns, I think we're going to be frustrated. Nick's absolutely right. We've had amazing successes in the past. We have been able to hold back the worst of some of the most ambitious depredations that capital has had in wait for us, at the WTO, for example, in defeating the multilateral agreement of investment, in all sorts of situations. But we haven't been able to create anything better because we haven't been able to take away the power that capital has won for itself. Now that, I suppose, is my final call. If we can see this as a political movement, if we consider it challenging those who are meant to represent us in Parliament and on the world stage, if we can band together with similar political movements in other countries, then we have a chance of making a difference and doing something, not just about ecocide and social justice and all of the other, but about creating a new world. So politics, politics, politics is all I would leave you with. Unless we can form that political challenge, then we don't have a chance. Thank you.
I must say it is wonderful, as others have said, to share in this, to know that the heart of decency, morality and social justice is still beating strongly, if not in Parliament. But it is beating elsewhere. And I do want to pay, if I may, a real vote of tribute to Polly for, and I'm sure everyone shares in this, for I think her magnificent work in being relentlessly determined to make the issue of ecocide the fifth crime against peace in the ICC Rome Statute. We all owe you a tremendous debt. And we can see you as the budding William Wilberforce of our age, and we're all with you. But if it is not to be curmudgeonly, I do want to make one specific point, Polly, because whilst you have, I think, answered one quite significant objection, namely that individual intent has to be proved by advancing the concept of presumptive responsibility, which I think is sufficient. There is the other main objection that all the other four issues of crime against peace, including crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide, all are built around the idea of the mass destruction of human life. And I do wonder whether your wonderful concept of ecocide could actually encapsulate this, because it would actually make it a lot easier to win the necessary 2/3 majority which you need in the Association of States Parties review of the ICC Rome Statute, as you very well know. And if I may very humbly suggest a stronger version of ecocide, which I wrote in the forecourt of a hotel in Manila last night. Ecocide is a crime of degrading the environment to such a degree as to threaten loss of life for humans and other species on a mass scale, whether locally, regionally, nationally or globally, either now or in the future. I'm not a lawyer, that's one of my few virtues, and maybe it needs to be legally tightened, but I offer it because I think that brings it much more into line with the other four, and it would be easier to get the votes of the necessary states. Now, I think this is very much justified for two considerations. It isn't just the frequency and the ferocity of climate upheaval, which is increasing, as it certainly is. It is the imminence of certain thresholds or tipping points which will unleash catastrophic feedback mechanisms. Let me explain what I mean. Let me just give some examples. One is the warming of the Siberian permafrost, which will release billions of tons of methane, which is 20 times more potent as a toxin compared to CO2. The dieback of the Amazon, which is, as we all know, the world's greatest rainforest, and at the moment is a tremendous absorber of CO2, will be turned into a desert and actually a producer, a generator of CO2. Or the collapse of the West Antarctic ice sheet, which will take quite a long time, but is clearly beginning to happen and is slowly beginning to accelerate, which will increase sea levels by 7 meters. Think of that, over 20 feet, which will certainly wipe out Bangladesh and Florida. It's always good when these things happen in the United States, because that means it's much more likely to be noticed by the world powers, as well as, of course, overrunning many coastal states. But the other consideration is this: biodiversity, which hasn't been mentioned tonight. Perhaps it's a jargon term, but I mean all life forms are now being destroyed at a rate which is between 100 and 1,000 times greater than in the historical and paleontological record. And when you take account of the fact that the world's food supply is very tightly interconnected, the cumulative destructive impact of that on all species, including humans, is probably incalculable. Well, having said that, which I think we all understand, these are just some of the worst examples, but there are so many. The real question, which is coming back to the question of politics, what is to be done to end this impasse which we are in, not only environmentally and ecologically, but also economically? Well, I think what is clearly needed is a new economic paradigm. Andrew gave a brilliant example of it in Goodland, but it could be framed in many ways, of course, which is based on true cost accounting, on a huge, by which I mean a 5-fold increase in renewable energy, and by big incentives for energy conservation and energy efficiency. And having said that, it's not all gloom and doom, and certainly Andrew indicated that many of these things in their own ways are happening already across the world. But even outside of good land, in the bad land, which is where most of us live, China, for example, is actually increasing the number of low-carbon zones across the country. Obama is determined to push through a new climate change bill, despite immense opposition from the Republican Tea Party. He's also tightening emission standards in power stations in the US, which is pretty important, including coal stations, which account for 40% of US energy. And California, which is actually the world's 12th largest economy, is actually now pioneering and pushing through the electrification of cars. There's the breakthrough to competitive renewable energy, which is clearly gaining traction and increasing speed. And indeed, it is industry which is now estimating that solar power without subsidy will now be the cheapest form of generating electricity anywhere across the world by 2020. That's industry saying that, not some soft leftists, like most of us. There is the sheer savagery of climate change. This is the other, I think, you can say it's a positive driver, it's a very vicious driver, but it may be necessary because people are addicted to their way of life and deeply unwilling to change. I came back last night, as I've just said, from the Philippines, where Typhoon Haiyan, the 4th most violent storm recorded in history, killed more than 6,000 people in Tacloban alone. Drought in Russia just 2 years ago destroyed a quarter of the grain harvest, which is not just important for Russia, but important for large parts of the world as well. The US has suffered. I would think it's important when the big powers suffer. If you have a typhoon in the Bay of Bengal and it hits Bangladesh, no one appears to notice. But if it's US, it's another matter. They've had 25 extreme weather events since 2011. And extreme weather events, which is a typical euphemism which we use, these are violent and vicious upheavals in the climate. Now kill over 500,000 a year across the world. and are now estimated to wreak damage which costs in excess of £1.5 trillion, not billion, trillion pounds a year. So, how do we, given all of that, which ought to be enough to create the change which we all want to see and which the world needs, how do you break this deadlock? And I come back to the question of politics. Well, possibly, who knows, a coalition of the G20, is it possible to think of that? Of the 30 big corporations which are actually seeking to green their operations already, and perhaps the 40 cities, there are at least 40 cities across the world, who are wrestling with their transition to low-carbon landscapes. And I think that may be, unless someone can come up with a better suggestion, the way in which we begin to break the stranglehold of what you were both talking about, which is the stranglehold of unbridled markets driven by financialized capitalism. That is the most powerful momentum in the world today, and extraordinarily dangerous for all the reasons which you so well set out in terms of damaging all the public values and principles which I think are so important to life. Indeed, I think the biggest problem for the left, if I may say so, is the abject failure of radical and progressive forces across the world to come up with any alternative ideology to market fundamentalism after the biggest crash for a century, in the course of the most prolonged recession since the 1870s. And then not just that, but also, which I think is absolutely key, and we're not even beginning to do this, to begin to generate the social movement, the deep-rooted and far-reaching, far-extended social movement, which is the only real basis of fundamental change. And that, I think, has got to include a reassertion of democratic governance. If in my view, accountability in our societies has more or less collapsed. Yes. I really believe it has. So we need that reassertion of democratic governance, because power, of course, has seeped away from Parliament. I mean, no one takes Parliament very seriously, which I do find very worrying, but it's certainly true, because power is now held by the banks, by the big corporates, by an over-dominant media. And once again, let me say, it is not all bleak. I sometimes think that George Osborne and our friends in the Eurozone under Merkel are actually really on our side by forcing down the throats of people in this country their catastrophically perverse economic policies of prolonged austerity. I saw a poll the other day which said that the public are now more up in arms against tax avoidance. I mean, the unbelievable degree of evasion of proper payment of tax by the rich and the enforcement of increased burdens on the poor than they are about any other abuse of corporate power. I like to believe, since I'm always going on about this, there is just some glimmer of recognition that the ultra-rich might actually pay a little out of their ill-earned gains. When the Sunday Times, not a left paper, the Sunday Times records that since the crash, when most of us have actually had to tighten our belt, the 1,000 richest persons in this country, only 1,000, and I can tell that's 0.003% of the population, it's a tiny number. What do you think's happened to them? Yes, you're right, they've increased their wealth, but do you realise it's by £190 billion? It is incredible that that can actually happen. We need a political movement. I would love to say, I mean, it used to be called the Labour Party. I would be laughed at if I went into Trafalgar Square and said that now the movement which is going to carry forward all the dreams and aspirations that you have is the Labour Party. I'm very saddened that that is not the case. I actually do have some beliefs in Ed Miliband. I think he is a person who has the right instincts, and I continue to support him. But I mean, we're not even beginning to accept the broadness, the depth of the requirement. And I don't think it's no use electing. You get one vote every 5 years. It's better than nothing, but it doesn't take you very far. And we need to begin again the political campaigning at the grassroots. It's wonderful to have a meeting like this. I've really enjoyed it. It's fired my spiritual batteries listening to other people who I discover at last share my views. But unless we get out into the streets and begin to tap that festering resentment and discontent and the desire for radical change, which I believe is just latent beneath the surface. I really believe that. Unless we begin to get to do that, I don't think we're going to have a politics. We are, right. I think we've done it. Okay, I'll leave it at that.
Every single moment that you spend here engaging with this is also part and parcel of putting in that energy. Energy can carry through money, through time, through how we decide, how we discern what we're going to put our own energies into to help make this a more beautiful world. Thank you all for coming here tonight.
Well done, Paul.